In this video with the AnKing, I'm going to talk about how I scored over 260 on USMLE Step 2. Now, this is going to be a long video, and I apologize for that. It's very similar to the video I did when I went over Step 1. And so here's an outline. All of this will be in the description if you want to skip ahead to other time codes. So my first thing I'm going to talk about is my background. And the next thing I'll talk about is a word on Step 1 becoming pass-fail. This seems to be a very common question that a lot of you have, and I want to address that. The next thing is my general study plan and how I did this. This includes everything over my third year, how I utilized Anki, what resources I used to learn the material, what tests I took, how well I did on them, test-taking tips I have, what I did in my dedicated period, like everything. I'm going to go over it all. The recommendations I have when you're actually on test day, because this is a very long test, and then some advice that I received, and then what I actually did and how I feel about that. So if you need help specifically for yourself, please reach out to us. We have a Patreon or our memberships. It's basically the same thing. We just couldn't manage handling 30 emails on our own, but there's a few of us. We're all very happy to help you, and we would love to, and we try to make it as cheap as possible just to make it affordable to you. The next thing is discounts. On our website, I list any discounts that companies give me. Some of them are affiliates, and some of them aren't. They really are just to help you. These are ones I've had in the past, and so check the description of this video if you want to check out some of those discounts. I tried just to make them there so they're available for med students, because I know that we are hit hard with a lot of things. Okay, so why am I sharing this video? Why am I even sharing what my score is? I actually really debated this when I shared my Step 1 score because I didn't want people to know. But ultimately, when I started AnKing, this was a project that was meant to help people. And when I first started medical school, I really only trusted advice from people that I knew did really well. And so that's why I'm willing to share. I want you to know this is what I did, and it worked. Very clearly worked. And I'm going to go into every little detail of why that may be. The other thing is we have recently started this much larger project, the Anki Palace. I've been partnering with people and stuff. We've made an online course. And then soon we're going to fund what we're going to call Anki Hub, which is basically you can use the Anki deck for Step 2. You find an error, you send it to me, I accept it, and everybody using the deck gets an immediate update. And so I'm using a lot of the money I'm earning to do this, and I really want to give back to this community and help because Anki's been so helpful for me. The next thing, like I mentioned, I made this Step 1 video on how I scored well, and it was one of my most popular videos, and I feel like I really was able to help people with this, and so that's why I'm making it for Step 2. And I've linked this video in the description as well if you want to watch this one. Okay, so my background. Why is this important? I feel like it's important because, for one, I'm a very good test taker. I started out with a high MCAT, a very high college GPA. I knew very early that I was interested in competitive specialties like dermatology. Other things I was considering was ENT, urology, things like that. So I started really early studying very hard. The other thing, this is because a lot of your curriculums are not the same as mine. I did 2 years preclinical just studying for Step 1, and then 1 year of clinicals and studying for Step 2. Some of you kind of have it mixed around, and just take that for granted, you know, or just take that into account as you were studying for this test, that my schedule was a little different than yours. Okay, I also rarely have test anxiety that affects my performance. If anything, I perform better when I'm under stress. So that's different for a lot of you. And if you have test anxiety, you're going to need to work on that. Study plan, I used Anki, and I used the Qbanks at the center of everything. So if you are like, I hate Anki, then this video is probably not going to be very helpful for you. Just so you were aware. And then this is also really important. My rotations were graded. About 50% of the grade was our evaluations, and only 25% was the shelf exam. So I didn't study as hard for the shelf exam because I didn't need to. Because I spent a lot of time in the hospital taking care of patients and trying to do better evaluations and things like that. So just take that into account. Alright, so pass-fail, and Step 1 becoming pass-fail, how is that going to affect Step 2? I think everyone can agree this is definitely going to affect Step 2. Step 2 is going to be a big deal. My advice to you is don't change things. Now, this was an unofficial survey done on Reddit, but you can see very clearly that Step 1 scores correlate with actual Step 2 scores. And I also want to point this out to all of you. This is really important. This is the percentiles for Step 1 and Step 2. A lot of people say, oh, Step 2 is easier, kind of a thing. Well, you have to realize this. So a 250 on Step 1 is the 82nd percentile, but a 260 on Step 2 is the 82nd percentile. So yes, your score went up, but percentile-wise, you were in the same area-ish. And you can see even on this unofficial survey that people scoring 250 on Step 1 were scoring about 260 on Step 2. So definitely still study for step 1. The other thing is, like 70 to 90% of the questions I had on my shelf exams were all step 1 material. And so obviously that builds into doing well on step 2. Okay, so my rotation schedule. Here's what my schedule looked like, with the top being the first half of the year, then bottom is the second half of the year. And I'm going to go through basically how I studied for each of these, because studying for those rotations was essentially studying for step 2. Now I have an entire playlist, and I've linked this into the description. It goes over every single rotation, what I did on that rotation, how I prepared for it, what socks I wore, like for surgery, and like literally everything for those rotations. And I tried to make this as helpful as possible. So go and watch that. I'm not going to go that into detail in this video. I'm basically going to only touch on things that affected step 2. But go watch this if you're on the rotations. I've got one for each of them. So I started here, and during my transitions week, before I started my 3rd year, I started doing the Anki cards for surgery. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I feel like this really was a good start for me and helped me a lot. Now, surgery had a lot of flashcards, so I ended up doing flashcards the first couple weeks of my surgery rotation, and then I just did AMBOSS practice questions, and I ended doing D. Virgilio in the last week, along with some of the MBMEs I did for each of the rotations. My surgery rotation was 6 weeks, so you can see how much that block represents, and all the other rotations that are a little bit shorter were 4 weeks. So now when I was on my electives, I didn't really study. Until the end, I started doing Anki again for my OB-GYN rotation. But keep in mind, at this point, I was still doing the Anki cards from the surgery deck. I did not suspend them or anything. And you don't have to do that. I did that to make it easier. It sucked at times, I'll be honest. It was hard. It was worth it in the end. But I know people who do well on step 2 and they don't do that. So just keep that in mind. Now, I started my OB-GYN rotation. I did AMBOSS practice questions, and I don't have a picture for it, but I also did UWIS practice questions for OB-GYN. And then the last 2 weeks of my OB-GYN rotation, I started doing the cards, the new cards for my PEDS rotation. And then I did the same thing here. I did the questions. In the last week or two, I started doing the cards for the family medicine rotation. The same thing here, but I waited, and then like the last week of my Christmas break, I started for the psych. And then I did more questions and then with psych, I supplemented with some UWorld questions because there wasn't enough for AMBOSS. But I primarily did AMBOSS there. I'm going to talk about the AMBOSS versus UWorld thing in a minute as well. At the end of my psych rotation, we had a baby. She's adorable. I love her. Her name's Sandy. So it was quite the experience to try and do this during the middle of 3rd year, but it's been a joy. And then you can tell I took a break. I started doing flashcards during that break, even though I was very tired getting up in the middle of the night with a baby for internal medicine. And then I did the AMBOSS cards there. I did more at the end. You get the idea. During my elective period here, I called this my pre-dedicated, essentially, and I'll talk about it more in detail in a minute. But I started doing UWorld questions. I had basically finished AMBOSS at this point. And I did UWorld every single week here, and basically all through dedicated until I took the test, and then I took a really nice vacation, which you should definitely do. Now, this slide is the resources I used for step 1. This is the exact slide I used in my step 1 video, and you can see there's a ton. I used a lot of resources. I did about 27,000 flashcards in the Anki deck. Step 2 was very different. I used these resources, basically just question banks, and then a little over 4,000 Anki cards. So a very, very different thing here. Now, I'm going to go over this because this is something I get a lot of questions on. Here are basically exactly what I did in terms of flashcard load for each rotation. So for my surgery rotation, I did about 1,300 cards. Now if you go look, there's quite a bit more than that, but I only did 1,300 of them. And when I say total flagged, that means I was looking through those flashcards, and I looked at it, and I decided I don't need that flashcard to answer a question correctly. Not necessarily that I don't know it. I don't need this flashcard to answer a question correctly. That's very important because a lot of these things for step 2 you can reason through with the knowledge you already have from step 1. And you don't want to bog yourself down with flashcards because you're going to be super busy. And then you can see I created 84 cards. So then in OB-GYN, it was a little bit better. I did less flashcards. I flagged more. I did create a little bit more because OB-GYN was kind of specific, and a lot of that is not covered in step 1 material. And then for PEDS, you can see I did even less flashcards, flagged even more. And then down to family med, again, same pattern you can see, and psych even less. Now with internal medicine, it's a larger bit, so I kind of bumped up a bit. But notice that I did 1,300 cards for surgery and only 700 for internal medicine. And that's because a lot of these flashcards overlap between. So something you learn in surgery is actually relevant to OB-GYN and family med and internal medicine. So your card load is going to decrease significantly throughout the year. You can see I flagged 1,500 cards at this point, meaning I felt comfortable with those cards. And then down to neuro, I had almost no flashcards left. Neuro is also very, very related to step 1. And then for step 2, there was almost nothing left in the deck. And I basically just created a lot of flashcards based off my missed questions. Okay, I made this video here, and I'm not going to do the actual demonstration in this video because it's already going to be a long video. But this video goes over how I found those flashcards that I did for each rotation in the AnKing Overhaul deck. It's very important. I would strongly recommend you go watch this video, and I'm going to link it in the description for you. But this video definitely is very supplementary to the video you're currently watching. Okay, so Qbanks. I mentioned I was going to touch on the Amboss versus UWorld difference. So I did Amboss for all of my rotations. And the reason I did Amboss is because Amboss was written for the clerkships. UWorld was written for step 2, and then they just backtracked and tried to separate all their questions out and make them kind of fit into a rotation. And I felt like Amboss was going to do better because they were specifically written for the shelf exams. I feel like that held true for most rotations. There were a couple where I felt maybe a little weaker, but in general, I feel like it did better. Now, I did 80% of Amboss, and the reason for that is when I first started, I did the 1, 2, 3, and 4 hammer difficulty questions. I never did the 5 hammer difficulty questions. But as I started noticing I was getting all the 1 hammer questions correct, and then I switched and just did 2, 3, and 4 hammer difficulty questions, and that's it. That made it so that I had more time to enjoy my free time, because when you're working 70 hours a week and then you got to go home and do practice questions, it's busy. So I felt like that really worked for me. Make sure you're getting all of the one hammer questions right before you do otherwise. And like I said, I didn't do the 5 hammers at all. I have 0 regrets. Now, UWorld, I did a little bit for psych, and then I did for my dedicated period. And I didn't complete a lot of it. You can see I did 57% of it. And I also wasn't performing that well, which made me a little worried. So hopefully this makes some of you feel a little better, because I still did great on the actual thing. And I feel like Amboss actually prepared me better. I know a lot of people have questions saying, Amboss sponsors us kind of a thing. This is not sponsored at all. This is what I actually did. This is how I actually feel. I'm not getting paid to say any of this in this video. I feel like Amboss just did a better job at preparing me. Okay, so my shelf and my practice test. I debated whether or not to actually share these, but I feel like it might be helpful to some of you, if anything, just to help your mental health and help you feel better, because I did not perform super good on all of these shelves, and like I said, it's because most of my score was my evaluations. So you can see on surgery, I scored, it was in the 83, and I know each school changes what that actually means in terms of honoring. OB-GYN, I did quite a bit better. This is primarily because I'm a male and I wasn't allowed to go into a lot of the childbirths, unfortunately. And so I sat around studying a lot of the day. Peds, I didn't do as well because I was really busy. And then you can see it basically the same pattern throughout, around the same scores, okay? And then I started dedicated, and here's basically what my dedicated looked like. I put those X's there because I was on vacation right after I finished my last rotation. So I had like 2.5 weeks of dedicated. And you can see where I did each of these tests in the timeline. So UWorld 1, I scored a 266. I was feeling pretty good about that. I felt like it was predicting well. NBME 8, I did the first block. I missed 2 questions. I felt like the questions were super easy. I talked to our academic advisor after finishing the first block, and he said, if you don't need to know like where you are baseline-wise, those tests are not very predictive at all. 6, 7, or 8 of the NBMEs. They're just not very predictive, and they're not great tests. And so I just stopped doing the test. I finished the first block, and I was like, I'm not learning anything from this. So I stopped, and I just did UWorld questions the rest of the day, and I think that was smart. Now, the next thing is UWorld 2. I did a 274, and you can see that was a couple days before I took the actual thing. Definitely over-predicted me just a tad. And then the free 120s, I got an 89%, but that was hard. This is the new free 120. I know there's an old one floating out there. It was hard, and I got lucky on a lot of questions. So don't beat yourself up if you don't do as well on this free 120. It's not like the step 1 free 120. And then, of course, on the real thing, I got over 260. I actually scored the exact same score I got on step 1. So I did bump down a little bit in percentile, like I mentioned earlier. But that didn't matter to me because I knew I just needed to get a certain score. This was my goal, and I wanted to spend time with my family, my cute baby, and so I didn't spend as much time on it as I could, and I still felt happy with it, and you can see how that went. Okay, so for my pre-dedicated period, just to bring this back and remind you, this when I was on this elective here, I was on a dermatology rotation. I suspended almost all of my cards. I kept the pharmacology, microbiology stuff that's like cold memorization. I kept those. I suspended everything else, so I had a way lighter card load. I made a lot of flashcards during this time, and I felt like that was helpful. I did about 1 block a day and reviewed that block every day after I got home from my elective for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then I made a missed questions filtered deck, which I feel like is so important. Everyone who's really utilized this has told me how much they love it. So watch our video. We got a video on this. We got a video on custom filtered decks. Go watch those if you don't know how to do it. But I promise setting that up is really going to be helpful to you. Okay, then my actual dedicated for like 2.5 weeks. I was doing 4 blocks, 4 UWorld blocks, and reviewing all of those blocks every single day, and I was going for about 12 hours with a little bit of a break in there. And then this is so important. I did not exercise a lot during my 3rd year. I'm probably in the worst shape I've ever been. But getting regular exercise is going to help your stress levels decrease, which is really important because even I was really stressed during this time. I was like, do I need to push this back? I was stressing. So get exercise is going to help you. Spend time with your family. Spend time doing your hobbies, those kinds of things. This is all really, really important. Don't burn out here at the end or it will affect your score. Okay, some general test-taking tips because I feel like Step 2 is more of a test-taking test than Step 1 was. Step 1 was kind of do you know it or you don't. This one brings back a little bit of can you reason through things. This is also a 50-50 test a lot of the time. I got things to 50-50 and just go with your gut on that. It's going to help. So the first thing, obviously, read the question first. You should read the question, read what the answer choices are so you know, like, oh, I'm looking at what type of imaging modality do I want to use, and this person has a stomach thing. And then read the actual question. But, read that last sentence that actually has the question in it first. I love this from the Golian Audio series. He says they are telling you the answer. And this has helped me so many times. If I was ever lost or felt like I had no idea what was going on, I usually would mark it and come back to it. And then I would tell myself, this question is telling me the answer. They are telling me things, one line or one lab value is going to rule out one of these answer choices. They're telling me the answer. And that will help you have confidence to answer it and find the things that are going to help you rule out the other choices. And I feel like this was more of a rule out test than Step 1 you could kind of just know the answer. This one you kind of had to cross things out and narrow it down. Highlight the most important things. This is crucial. If you can highlight the right things, you will get the answer right. And then, like I said, crossing things off. I feel like that was a lot more important in this. And I actually made this video. I spent a lot of time on this video. And with the whole AnKing team, actually, we pooled our ideas and made this video. And I feel like this is really going to be helpful for you if you are working on missed questions. You are learning from your missed questions during your 3rd year, basically. You don't have resources, like I mentioned, with online med-ed or things as much as you did in your Step 1 studies. And so learning how to learn from your missed questions is going to be very important. I'll link this in the description. Okay, the day before test day, what did I do? I did nothing. I didn't study, really. I exercised, pray, meditate, spend time with your family and friends, go on a hike, do something to relax. This is really important. And I put that here too, relax the day before. I did do about 1 hour of I want to review this just real quick. And that included things like looking at a Wells score for PE, some biochem stuff. And then I'm going to mention in a second some other these AMBOSS cards for ethics and stuff. I didn't make an equation sheet, but I didn't actually end up writing it during the actual test. I felt like my biostats was significantly less on my exam. I had a lot more ethics, so I didn't actually make it. But if you need an equation sheet, I would definitely recommend getting that ready. And then these are AMBOSS learning cards. If you log into AMBOSS and you search Principles of Medical Law and Ethics, it'll come up with a learning card. They are amazing. You're probably going to get a couple questions every block on ethics and biostats and stuff like that. And these 3 AMBOSS cards are amazing. So go read these learning cards. Definitely read them the day before the test, but probably would be best to have read them earlier. Okay, and then the actual test day, what I did is I ate a really high-fat protein breakfast to hold me over. I went to McDonald's. It was great. I got a high protein lunch, so I brought things like trail mix, protein bar, things like that was going to hold me over and not give me a sugar crash. And then I did actually bring a Dr. Pepper and drank the whole thing. I felt like that really helped because step 2 is a block longer than step 1. And then plan your breaks because it's a long test. It's a long day. And you can see here's basically how I did mine. So I took the first 4 blocks almost back to back and then took a really long half-hour lunch break. And then I kind of had to take a couple breaks to go get some of my Dr. Pepper in between those last ones. And then from block 7 to block 8, I just was ready to go. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. But you may find that it's better for you to just do 10-minute breaks in between each or whatever. But definitely figure out what works for you. And then breathe. I feel like that is so important. You are going to get stressed. I got stressed, and I'm not usually the type to get stressed. It's a stressful thing. Breathe, calm yourself down. It's going to help you perform better. And if you need to take a break, just take a break for a second so you come back and perform better. Okay, so advice I received versus what I actually did. The first one is everybody told me you gotta watch Online Med Ed. You gotta watch Sketchy Step 2. You gotta watch the new Boards and Beyond Step 2. I didn't. I never watched a single video on anything. I literally just used Anki and the practice questions. So Anki was kind of learning things. And people say, well, you've said for years you have to learn the material before you do the flashcard on it. That's true. However, a lot of these things just make sense. And when you start doing the Anki cards, you'll understand what I mean. But for example, you're learning an algorithm in surgery on what do you do if you have a worry that somebody's got bleeding into their abdomen. Well, if they're unstable, you're going to run them to the straight to the OR. If they're stable, then you can do an ultrasound, you can do a CAT scan, you have time to do these things. So just reading the flashcard alone was all I needed to be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense because of my step 1 background. So that's really important. But however, on my surgery rotation, I felt like things did start to get a little fragmented and I didn't get the big picture, and I wish I would have gone back and watched Online Med Ed to kind of get the big picture. Online Med Ed has been recommended to me by about everybody. I haven't tried any of these resources, so I can't truly recommend them. But a lot of the other members of the AnKing team used Online Med Ed and some of these other resources, and they really liked it. So, number 2. Everyone told me, do your practice questions at the hospital when you have downtime. I almost never did, except for on my OB/GYN rotation, like I mentioned. I actually spent most of my time looking up stuff for patients, reading on UpToDate, things like that. And I felt like that did help to an extent on the shelf exams, but not as much as everybody makes it sound, unfortunately. Because just the shelf exams just have these quirky things that you'll never see. And like on my surgery, I did pediatric surgery, so I never saw anything other than appendectomies. And so when it got to the actual surgery shelf, I didn't know a lot of that from my experiences in the hospital. It was all practice questions. This also you have to take into account is because my evaluations were worth 50% of my grade. My shelf was worth 25%. And so when I was in the hospital, I worked hard. I still felt like I had enough time to do things outside the hospital. But you can still make it work. But I just wanted to make you aware. I'm not recommending one way or the other with this. All right, the next one is go slow enough to think about your cards and really understand the why behind the cards. What I actually did is I went way too fast. I did cards really late in the day. I was tired. It was not good. And I felt like my retention rate suffered. So try and do your cards early and take the extra 10 or 20 minutes a day to go a little bit slower. I think I would have performed better on my shelf exams if I had done that. And you're only doing, I was maxing at like 100, 130 Anki reviews a day. So it's not a lot. It's very doable. I just was lazy. That's the honest truth. So don't do what I did. The next thing here is people said do your Anki cards during the rotation. I did them 1 to 2 weeks before the rotation, as I showed you earlier in this video. And I felt like that was so good for me. Because not only was I ready to rock and roll as soon as I started, but I also had some of this understanding for the actual rotation itself and helping the patients. And I feel like the attendings I worked with noticed that, and I kind of had an idea of what was going on. It wasn't that hard to do. You just have to start doing that at the very beginning. So I would definitely recommend you do this. Okay, the next one here is the advice that I've been getting for years and years. Even the advice that I gave out for years and years. My recommended settings video and stuff was to set a max interval around like 6 months or so. I would now say don't set a max interval. Just don't. Be really good about saying when you forgot your card, but I would recommend that you just let it be. Your max interval can be 1-2 years or just set it to 99999. I don't think that it's actually going to change your retention or performance. The next one here is to increase the AnKing interval modifier, which basically makes it so that every time you do a card, rather than multiplying by 2.5% or whatever the ease is, you do 2.5% times something. And I set mine actually to 140%. So it was 2.5 times 1.4. So my cards were spaced out a lot. Now looking back, I felt like they were spaced maybe a little bit too much. And like I mentioned when I was talking about my background, I have a good memory and I'm a good test taker. And I feel like I probably would have backed off and gone to 120%. If you're just like, I don't really care how well I perform, then you could do 140% and have less cards. But I feel like maybe 120 would have been the sweet spot. Next one here is the advice I got was do every card for all the rotations. Just go through the deck and do all of them. And I didn't, and I would not recommend that. You saw how many I said that I flagged, or I looked at and said I don't need this flashcard, so I flagged it so that I wouldn't have to go back and look at it again and think, do I need to do this? But when you're going through the cards, think, will this help me answer a practice question correctly? If it won't, then just skip it. You know, there was like, one card I had was, what is the most common cause of septic bursitis? Well, I didn't know off the top of my head, but the answer was Staph aureus. Well, if you had given me a bunch of bugs and asked me which one is most likely to cause bursitis, I would have put Staph aureus, or I would have guessed that even if I didn't. So reading that flashcard once was all I needed to remember. I did that flashcard almost a year ago. I never actually reviewed it. I flagged it, and you can tell I still remember it to this day just because it made sense. So really try and limit your flashcards because it will help you in the long run. And ultimately, that is really all the advice I had for you. I went into as much detail as I possibly could. Like I said before, if you need individualized help, we have our memberships or our Patreon. I'm more than happy to help to configure your study schedules or whatever it may be. I really hope this video has been helpful, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks for learning with the AnKing. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel here, as well as follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Patreon. That is at AnKingMed. Also, feel free to reach out via email or check out our website, ankingmed.com, for more tips and tricks.